The morning Eliza Sawyer picked up the pen and signed her name to a cattle contract worth more money than most men in Cutter's Bluff, Texas would see in a decade. She did it without hesitation, without trembling, and without waiting for anyone's permission. And that, more than anything else, was what made Raymond Fletcher fall completely and irrevocably in love with her. But the story did not begin with the signing. It began 6 months earlier, in the brutal summer of 1878, when the dust of the Texas Panhandle was so thick it coated the inside of a man's lungs and left everything the color of burnt clay. It began with a letter, a funeral, a ranch on the edge of ruin, and a woman who had decided that grief was a luxury she could not yet afford. Eliza Sawyer was 31 years old when her husband Daniel Sawyer died of a fever that swept through the county like wildfire in late July. He was gone in 4 days. She had sat beside his bed every hour of those 4 days, pressing cool cloths to his forehead, feeding him broth he could not swallow, and praying with every fragment of faith she still possessed. On the morning of the 5th day, she woke to find his hand cold in hers. She buried him on the small hill behind the house, under the single live oak tree that had somehow survived 3 dry summers. She planted a wooden cross, said the words herself because the preacher was 2 towns over and Daniel could not wait, and then she walked back down the hill, went inside, and looked at the ledger on the kitchen table. The numbers were not kind. The Sawyer Ranch, Broken Bow, Daniel had called it, though Eliza had never loved that name, sat on 430 acres of decent grassland north of Cutter's Bluff. They ran 280 head of longhorn cattle, had 3 hired hands, a small barn, a larger stable, and a farmhouse that needed a new roof on its western side. What they did not have was enough money to get through the winter. Daniel had been a dreamer, a good man, a loving husband, a devoted father to their 7-year-old daughter Nora, but not always a careful businessman. He had extended credit to a neighbor who never paid it back. He had bought too many heads last season at too high a price. He had borrowed from the bank in Cutter's Bluff, a loan held by Mr. Clarence Holt, who was not known for his patience or his mercy. The loan was due in full by the 1st of October. Eliza sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open in front of her and did the arithmetic 3 times, hoping the numbers would change. They did not. She needed to sell her cattle at the fall drive, and she needed to sell them well, and she needed to do it fast enough to pay Holt before he came looking with his lawyer and his lien papers. That was when she heard about the contract. Word spread through Cutter's Bluff the way all-important news spread in a small Texas town, through the general store, through the post office, through the women at the well and the men at the saloon. A cattle broker named Raymond Fletcher had arrived from Fort Worth representing a purchasing consortium that was buying longhorns for supply contracts with the United States Army posts along the Rio Grande. They were offering above-market prices, paying in certified bank drafts, and moving fast. Fletcher was only in the county for 2 weeks before he would move on to the next territory. Eliza heard about it on a Thursday afternoon when she rode into town to pick up flour and salt, and ended up in conversation with Martha Greer, outside the mercantile. Martha was the wife of the largest rancher in the county, Hector Greer, and she said her husband had already had a meeting with Fletcher and found him to be a straight shooter. "Hector says the man knows cattle," Martha said, pulling her shawl tighter even though it was still 90 degrees in the shade. "Knows the trail, knows the markets, and he's paying fair. Better than fair, actually. $40 a head for prime longhorns, Eliza. $40. Eliza had done the math before Martha finished the sentence. 280 head. Even if she held back 40 for next season's breeding stock, left 240 head to sell. At $40 a head, that was $9,600. The bank loan was $4,200. The back wages she owed her hands came to just over $300. She would come out of it with something left over, enough to repair the roof, enough to get through the winter, enough to breathe. She thanked Martha, went back to her horse, and rode straight to the hotel where Fletcher was staying. She had imagined him old. She was not sure why. The word broker made her think of someone gray-haired and bespectacled, someone who sat behind a desk and scratched numbers into ledgers. The man who opened the door of room 7 at the Cutter's Bluff Hotel was none of those things. Raymond Fletcher was 35 years old, tall without being imposing, lean in the way of men who spend more time in the saddle than at a table. He had dark hair that curled slightly at the collar and eyes that were an unusual shade of gray-green, the color of the sage that grew along the creek banks in early spring. He was in his shirt sleeves, suspenders hanging loose at his sides, and he was clearly in the middle of working through a stack of papers when she knocked. He opened the door and looked at her with an expression that was polite but slightly confused, as if he had been expecting someone else. "Mrs. Sawyer," he said, and then caught himself. "I'm sorry, I don't believe I know you." "I'm Raymond Fletcher." "I know who you are," Eliza said. "I am Eliza Sawyer. I own the Broken Bow Ranch north of town. I have 240 head of prime longhorn cattle that I would like to sell to your consortium, and I understand you are leaving in 2 weeks, so I thought it best not to waste time on formalities." There was a pause. Raymond Fletcher looked at her for a moment, and she could see him recalibrating, the way men always did when they realized the person standing in front of them was not what they expected. "Please come in," he said, and stepped back from the door. The room was small and businesslike. There was a desk pushed against the window, covered in maps and papers and a leather-bound ledger of his own. There were 2 chairs, a washstand, and a narrow bed with a single blanket. Eliza sat in one of the chairs without being asked. Raymond sat across from her and looked at her with what she would later recognize as genuine interest, though at the time she read it only as assessment. "I heard about your husband," he said carefully. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you," Eliza said. She had learned in the weeks since Daniel's death that the best way to receive condolences was quickly and without elaboration. "I would like to discuss the contract." Raymond studied her for a moment. "I typically deal with the ranch owner directly," he said. "You are dealing with the ranch owner directly," Eliza said. He blinked. "Of course," he said. "Yes, I apologize." She could see that he was not being condescending. He was genuinely recalibrating, and to his credit, he did it without fuss. He opened the leather ledger, uncapped his ink bottle, and said, "Tell me about your herd." So she told him. She told him everything, the lineage of her breeding stock, the condition of the grazing land, the water sources on the property, the health of the animals, the approximate weights. She had learned all of it from Daniel, had ridden the property with him every week for 8 years, had kept her own parallel set of notes in a small journal she carried in her apron pocket. She knew her cattle the way a doctor knows his patients, and it showed. Raymond Fletcher listened without interrupting. He made notes. He asked precise questions about the quality of the grass in the north pasture, about whether the creek had run reliably that summer, about whether any animals had shown signs of the tick fever that had plagued ranches to the south. Eliza answered each question directly and accurately, and by the end of the hour, she could see that he was impressed. "I'd like to come see the herd," he said. "Before I commit to numbers, I need to make an inspection. That's standard." "Of course," Eliza said. "Saturday morning." "Saturday morning," he agreed. She stood, and so did he, quickly enough that it was clearly a reflex of good manners rather than afterthought. He held out his hand, and she shook it. His grip was firm and warm, and she noticed, against her better intentions, that his hands were the hands of a man who had done real work, calloused at the right places, sure in their pressure. She rode home with the late afternoon sun turning the dusk golden around her horse's hooves, and told herself firmly that the only thing that mattered was the contract. Raymond Fletcher drove out to the Broken Bow Ranch on Saturday morning in a rented wagon, accompanied by a young man named Pete who worked as his assistant and handled the horses. Eliza was already waiting at the gate with her foreman, a weathered Mexican-American man named Luis Vega, who had worked the broken bow for 11 years, and who looked at Raymond with the particular measuring stare of a man who had seen many outsiders come and go, and had learned to reserve his judgment. Eliza gave Raymond a complete tour of the property. They rode the north pasture first, where the herd was gathered in the shade of a long ridge, and she watched Raymond move among the animals with easy confidence, checking hooves and eyes and flanks, talking quietly to Lewis about weights and conditions. She had expected him to be performative about it, the way some buyers were, putting on a show of expertise. He was not. He was quiet and thorough, and Lewis, who trusted no one quickly, began nodding along with his observations. "Your grass is good," Raymond said to her as they rode the southern boundary. "You've managed the grazing well. You didn't overgraze this summer even with the dry conditions. That tells me something about how this ranch has been run." "Thank you," Eliza said. He glanced at her sideways. "I understand the difficulty of your situation. I want you to know I'm not here to take advantage of it." She felt something tighten in her chest, not softness exactly, but something adjacent to it, some response to the plain decency of what he had just said. She had spent the past month steeling herself against people who would try to use Daniel's death to get favorable terms from her. The bank, the feed supplier who had quietly raised his prices. Even a neighboring rancher who had casually mentioned buying out part of her land. "I appreciate that," she said, and she meant it. They ate lunch at the kitchen table. Eliza had made biscuits and there was cold beef and coffee, and she let Nora join them, because Nora had been hovering at the edges of every adult conversation since Daniel died, desperate to understand what was happening to her world. Nora was a serious child with her mother's dark eyes and her father's reckless curiosity. She sat across from Raymond and studied him with a directness that might have been rude in another context, but was so obviously genuine that it simply came across as honest. "Are you going to buy our cows?" she asked. "I'm thinking about it," Raymond said with equal gravity. "They're good cows," Nora said. "My papa raised most of them from calves." "I could tell," Raymond said. "Well looked after." Nora nodded as if this confirmed something she had already decided. She returned to her biscuit and did not ask any more questions, which seemed to be her version of approval. After lunch, Raymond and Eliza sat on the porch in the diminishing heat of the afternoon and discussed the terms. He was offering $38 a head for prime animals, which was slightly below the 40 Martha Greer had mentioned, but still significantly above the going market rate. He explained the difference calmly. The drive to the army posts was longer than anticipated, transportation costs had risen, and he was working within a fixed budget allocation from the consortium. Eliza listened to all of it and then said, "$39.50. Raymond looked at her. "Your prime animals will average better than you're pricing for," she said. "Your inspection confirmed it. Lewis and I have the weights recorded going back 3 years. These aren't range cattle, Mr. Fletcher. They've been selectively bred and well pastured, you know that." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, $39.50, Eliza said, "and I'll have them ready for your drovers at the county road on the first Monday of September, which saves you an extra day of drive time." Raymond Fletcher looked at her across the porch railing for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. It was subtle, a slight lift at one corner of his mouth, the kind of thing that wasn't quite a smile but was the raw material of one. $39.25, he said. "That's my final number." Eliza considered it. She was not going to push beyond the point of diminishing returns. $39.25 on 240 head was $9,420. More than enough. "Agreed," she said. She expected him to produce the contract then, to hand it to her with the firm understanding that she would review it, take it to a lawyer perhaps, and sign it at some later and more formal occasion. That was how these things were done, slowly, with masculine ceremony, with witnesses and deliberation. Instead, Raymond pulled the draft contract from the leather satchel he had brought and laid it on the porch rail between them. It was a standard form with blanks filled in his neat, precise hand. He had already written in 3925, she noticed. He had already written in 240 head. He had written in September 1st as the delivery date. He had clearly come prepared for more than one outcome. "I'll need to review it," Eliza said, reaching for the document. "Of course, take the time you need. I can come back," but Eliza was already reading, and she read the way she had learned to read everything important thoroughly, without rushing, checking every clause against her understanding of the deal they had discussed. She sat on the porch rail with the afternoon light coming over her shoulder and read the contract twice. It was straightforward and fair, reflecting everything they had agreed to. There was nothing hidden in the language, no subtle clauses that shifted liability unfairly, no ambiguities that would hurt her if the deal was later disputed. She turned to the last page. There was a line for the seller's signature. Raymond had half risen from his chair, moving toward her with the instinct to, she wasn't certain what exactly, to take it back and walk her through it, to suggest she have someone review it for her, to insert himself between her and the decision in some well-meaning but ultimately unnecessary way. She picked up the pen from the porch rail where he had set it down with the contract and signed her name clearly and fully, Eliza Sawyer. She handed the contract back to Raymond before he had fully stood. He took it. He looked down at her signature. He looked up at her. And whatever he had been about to say dissolved somewhere between his intention and his mouth, because he could see immediately that there was nothing to object to, nothing to suggest, nothing to offer that she had not already handled herself with complete competence and complete authority. He was quiet for just a moment, and then he sat back down. "Well," he said, and there was something in his voice that was warmer than professional approval. "That's settled then." "That's settled," Eliza agreed and picked up her coffee cup. They sat on the porch for another hour, and somehow the conversation moved from cattle to the county, from the county to the drought, from the drought to the question of whether the Santa Fe Railroad would push its line further south, from that to books. Raymond had been reading Grant's memoirs, which had just been published that year, and Eliza had opinions about the Civil War that were sharper than he expected. And somewhere in that hour, the conversation stopped being about business. It was Nora who ended it, appearing at the screen door to announce that she was hungry and that dinner would not make itself. Raymond Fletcher stood, put on his hat, shook Eliza's hand again, and said he would send his drovers on the agreed date. He climbed into the rented wagon and drove back toward town, and Eliza stood at the gate and watched him go with a feeling she did not immediately identify. It took her until she was inside, standing at the stove, to recognize it. It was the feeling of having been seen, not as a widow, not as a problem to be managed, but as a person conducting her own affairs. It had been a long time since she had felt that way. She pushed it aside and made dinner. Raymond Fletcher had not meant to come back to Broken Bow before September. He had his schedule, his other ranchers to visit, his reports to write, and a life in Fort Worth that was perfectly orderly and completely empty in ways he had stopped examining, because examining them did nothing useful. He came back on the following Wednesday, ostensibly because he wanted to clarify a question about the delivery logistics. This was at least partly true. But Luis Vega, who was saddling horses in the yard when Raymond rode up, gave him a look that suggested the foreman was not entirely convinced by the logistics explanation. Eliza was in the north pasture when Raymond arrived, helping one of her hands, a young man named Tomás, barely 18, who had been with the ranch for 2 years, check on a heifer that had been limping for 2 days. She was kneeling in the dirt beside the animal's rear leg, her dress dusty to the knee, her hair escaping from its pins in the afternoon wind. She looked up when she heard Raymond's horse and said, "You came back." "I had a question about the delivery route," he said. She said, returning her attention to the heifer's hoof, where she was working a small piece of embedded rock free with a narrow-bladed knife. "Can it wait 10 minutes?" "Of course," Raymond said, dismounted, and stood at the fence rail watching her work with the particular stillness of a man who is paying closer attention than he means to. She got the rock out, cleaned the hoof carefully, checked it again, and stood up with the fluid economy of movement that comes from years of physical labor done well. She pressed the heifer's flank gently, and the animal stepped off with only the slightest favoring of the leg. "She'll be fine," Eliza said, to no one in particular, and pulled her knife on her skirt hem to clean it. She walked to the fence rail where Raymond was standing and said, "The delivery route question." "Yes," he said. "I was looking at the map and I wondered if you had concerns about the section along the creek crossing. The ground can be soft after rains, and I've heard there's some damage to the bridge." They discussed the delivery route. It took about 12 minutes. And then they kept talking for another 3 hours, walking the eastern boundary of the property where Eliza was considering expanding her breeding stock in the spring, discussing the relative merits of different crosses, the economics of the cattle market, the unpredictability of the weather. He stayed for supper again. This time Nora talked more, asking Raymond questions about Fort Worth, about the cities she had read about in her school books, about whether he had ever been to Chicago or New York. He answered each question with the seriousness it deserved, which was all Nora required of anyone. After Nora went to bed, Eliza and Raymond sat at the kitchen table with the lamp between them and talked until very late. She told him about coming to Texas from Tennessee as a young bride, about the first years of the ranch when they had nothing and built it up slowly, about Daniel's better qualities and his less practical ones, about the love that had lived between them and the grief that had replaced it. She was not sure why she told him so much. She was not normally a woman who disclosed herself readily to strangers. He told her about Fort Worth, about the cattle business, about his family in Missouri and why he had left, about a woman he had once intended to marry 7 years ago, who had decided that a man who was always traveling between markets was not the right kind of husband. He said it without bitterness, though she could hear the old shape of the wound in his voice. "Do you agree with her?" Eliza asked. "That you're not the right kind of husband?" Raymond considered the question seriously, which she appreciated. He did not deflect with humor. "I think I believed her," he said. "For a long time, but lately I'm less certain." She looked at him in the lamplight. He looked back. The house was very quiet, the way the plains are quiet at night, a bigness of silence that presses around the walls. "You should probably ride back before it gets later," Eliza said finally. "I should," he said, and stood. "Mrs. Sawyer." "Eliza," she said. There was a brief, charged stillness. "Eliza," he said, and the way her name sounded in his voice was different from the way she had heard it for years. It had weight to it, intention, the beginning of something. "Thank you for supper." "Thank you for coming," she said. He put on his hat, shook her hand at the door again out of some habit of formality that they both knew had already become a kind of joke between them, and she stood in the doorway and watched him ride back into the darkness. She closed the door and leaned against it and breathed very carefully for several seconds. She was not ready for this. She had not been a widow for 2 months. She had a child and a ranch and a debt to pay, and a dozen practical concerns that all demanded to be first in line. She was not ready for the feeling that had taken up residence in her chest somewhere, between signing the contract and watching Raymond Fletcher ride away twice now. But feelings, she had learned, did not ask permission. The weeks that followed took on a particular rhythm. Raymond had legitimate business with several other ranches in the county, and sometimes this business brought him along the road that passed within half a mile of Broken Bow. These occasions became, with increasing frequency, visits. He began to help with things, not in a way that suggested she could not manage them herself, but in the way of someone who was looking for reasons to stay a little longer. He helped Lewis fix a section of fence that had come down in a windstorm. He rode out with Eliza when she went to check on the cattle in the far north pasture, because she had mentioned the ride was long to do alone. He brought Nora a book from town, a collection of illustrated natural history plates that he had found in the general store's back shelf, because Nora had mentioned that she liked animals and he had thought of her when he saw it. That was the thing about Raymond Fletcher. He paid attention. He remembered the specific things people said, and he acted on them, quietly and without announcement, in ways that demonstrated that he had been listening not just to the words but to the meaning underneath them. Eliza noticed all of it. She noticed it the way you notice a river rising gradually, and then suddenly, and with the clear understanding that the landscape is changing. Luis Vega noticed too, and said nothing, which from Luis was a form of approval. It was on a Tuesday afternoon in late August when things became unavoidably clear. Raymond had ridden out to finalize the details of the drive. The drovers would come on September 3rd now, not the 1st, due to a delay with another rancher, and they had worked through the logistics over coffee on the porch. The business was done in an hour, and they both knew it, and neither of them moved to end the visit. They walked out to the corral fence, where Eliza's personal horse, a bay mare named Copper, was grazing in the small enclosure. Eliza leaned on the top rail and watched the horse, and Raymond stood beside her, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him. "I leave the county the week after the drive," Raymond said. Eliza kept her eyes on Copper. "I know," she said. "There are contracts in New Mexico territory after this, and then I'm expected back in Fort Worth for the winter." "I know," she said again. A pause. The wind moved through the mesquite at the fence edge. "I don't want to go," Raymond said. Eliza turned to look at him then and found him already looking at her, and the thing between them that had been building for weeks was right there on the surface, undeniable now. "That's a large thing to say," she said carefully. "I know," he said. "I've been trying to figure out how to say something smaller and I can't seem to manage it." Eliza turned to face him fully. She looked at him the way she had looked at the contract, directly, thoroughly, checking the truth of what was in front of her. "I am not going to pretend I don't understand what you mean," she said. "But I am also not in a position to be quick about things. I have a child and a ranch, and I have not been a widow for 3 months yet, and I don't know what I feel clearly enough to say it out loud." "That's honest," he said. "I try to be," she said. "So do I," he said. "Which is why I needed to say I don't want to go, rather than saying nothing and riding away and spending the winter in Fort Worth wondering about it." She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her chest was doing something very inconvenient. "Write to me," she said. "When you're in New Mexico and in Fort Worth, write to me and I'll write back and let's see what we understand by spring." He nodded slowly. "And the week before I leave, come for supper," she said. "Bring your logistics questions." He laughed, a real laugh, low and warm, the first time she had heard him laugh without restraint, and the sound of it moved through her like the first good rain of a dry summer. The drovers came on September 3rd with Raymond at their head, 6 experienced cowboys in dusty hats who worked with efficient speed. Luis had the cattle gathered at the county road by dawn, and Eliza was there with them, watching the count. Raymond stood beside her as his head drover. A steady-eyed man named Bert Calloway tallied the animals one by one. 238 head. 2 animals had been pulled from the sale. One had developed a joint problem that Eliza caught the week before and chose not to disclose and quietly set aside, and one had been a late addition she decided to keep for breeding. Raymond produced the adjusted contract draft without being asked, with the number corrected to 238 and a bank draft in the corresponding amount. "You already adjusted it," Eliza said. "Luis sent word yesterday," Raymond said. "I had the numbers prepared." She looked at the bank draft. $9,332.50 drawn on the Fort Worth National Bank. She folded it and put it in her coat pocket. "It's been a pleasure doing business with you, Mr. Fletcher," she said formally, because Bert Calloway and his men were within earshot. "The pleasure was entirely mine, Mrs. Sawyer," Raymond said, just as formally, and the shared private amusement of the formality between them was enough. The drive moved out onto the county road in a long, dusty column, the cattle moving well in the cool September morning. Eliza stood at the road's edge and watched them go, and Raymond sat his horse at the rear of the column and looked back at her before he crested the first low rise, and she raised one hand, and he touched the brim of his hat, and then he was gone over the hill. She turned back to Louis and Tamaz and said, "Let's ride home." She went to the bank in Cutter's Bluff that same afternoon and paid Clarence Holt $4,212, the full amount of the loan with the month's interest calculated to the day. She paid it in certified bank draft, watched Holt's expression shift from practiced condescension to something that was almost respect as he processed the paperwork, and she walked out of the bank into the bright September afternoon and stood on the boardwalk and breathed. She was free of the debt. The ranch was clear. She had $3,120 left after paying the hands and covering the ranch expenses for the rest of the year. She was going to be all right. She bought a lemon candy at the general store for Nora and a good pen and a bottle of ink for herself, because she was going to need them. The first letter from Raymond arrived in early October, postmarked from Santa Rosa, New Mexico Territory. It was 2 pages long, written in his precise hand, and it was ostensibly about the cattle markets in New Mexico, but was actually about everything else: the landscape, which he described in a way that made her want to see it, the people he met, a book he was reading, a question he had been thinking about since he left, which was whether she had decided what to plant in the kitchen garden in spring. She wrote back 6 pages. She told him about the first frost coming early, about Nora's reading lessons, about the roof she had finally hired someone to fix, about the conversation she'd had with Louis about expanding the herd in the spring, about her thoughts on the New Mexico landscape as he had described it. She told him about a hawk that had taken up residence in the live oak above Daniel's grave, and how she had come to find it comforting rather than ominous. She wrote about missing Daniel in the specific ways that grief works, not constantly or overwhelmingly, but in the sudden sharp moments, the evening light hitting the porch a certain way, the smell of coffee in the morning. She wrote honestly, and he wrote honestly back, and through the winter they built something between them letter by letter, the way a fence is built rail by rail slowly, with intention, becoming solid. By December his letters had stopped being about business. He told her that Fort Worth was cold, and that the winter social season was full of events he was expected to attend and found mostly tedious. He told her that he had been to a dance at the Cattlemen's Association Christmas gathering, and had spent most of it thinking about a conversation they had had on her porch about whether the Santa Fe Railroad would change the economics of the whole territory. He told her that he was thinking about coming back to Cutter's Bluff in the spring. She wrote back, "I think Broken Bow could use another inspection." His response was almost immediate, "I'll be there in April." The winter was long, but it was the good kind of long, full of useful work, of Nora's growing vocabulary and her endless questions, of Louis teaching Tamaz to manage the small winter herd, of Eliza making plans for the spring expansion with the security of knowing she had the means to execute them. She ordered 2 quality breeding bulls through a catalog, arranged for their delivery in March. She had the western side of the barn replanked. She began teaching herself the rudiments of accounting from a textbook she ordered from a bookseller in San Antonio, because she was determined that the Broken Bow's finances would never again be managed by Hope alone. She was not, she told herself firmly, waiting for April. She was simply getting on with her life in a way that happened to be leading toward April. She was absolutely, entirely waiting for April. He came on the 14th of April, 1879, riding into the yard on a good gray horse that was not a rented livery animal but his own, which meant he had ridden from somewhere significantly further than Cutter's Bluff. He was thinner than she remembered, or perhaps it was just that she had been remembering him imprecisely through the winter, and the reality of him was different from the memory. He was also more familiar than she expected, his face immediately readable to her in a way that only comes from sustained attention. Nora came tearing out of the house before Eliza could get to the door, having heard a horse in the yard, and apparently decided without evidence that it must be Raymond. "You came back," Nora said, which was exactly what her mother had said the second time he visited, and which made Raymond smile in a way that reached his eyes completely. "I said I would," he said, and dismounted, and ruffled Nora's hair gently and looked up over her head to find Eliza standing in the doorway, and the look between them held everything the letters had been building toward, all of it compressed into a single moment. "Welcome back," Eliza said. "It's good to be back," he said, and he meant it in a way that went far beyond the ranch. He had arranged his schedule so that he would be in the county for 3 weeks. He had a few legitimate business calls to make on other ranches, and he made them. But the center of gravity of those 3 weeks was Broken Bow, and everyone in Cutter's Bluff who had paid attention through the previous fall understood this perfectly well. They rode together every morning when the day's work allowed it. They argued about cattle breeding philosophy and the reliability of the Fort Worth market and the right approach to water rights in a drying climate. They read aloud to each other in the evenings. He was working through a collection of George Eliot's novels, and she was reading a natural history of the Texas plains that she had found in the back of the mercantile, while Nora did her lessons at the other end of the table. It was on a Wednesday evening, the second week of April, that everything clarified completely. They had been sitting on the porch after supper, the evening cool and smelling of new grass, and the conversation had wandered into the comfortable silence that develops between two people who no longer need to fill every space. The sky was going from orange to the particular deep purple that precedes the first stars, and Raymond was watching the horizon with an expression that Eliza had come to recognize as the one he wore when he was about to say something important. "I want to say something," he said. "I know," she said. He turned to look at her. "You know. You have a specific face," she said. He almost smiled. "I want to say that I've spent this winter thinking about a great many things, and most of them have led back to the same place, which is that I am in love with you. I understand that this is early by some measures and that there are practical complications, and I'm not asking you for anything tonight, but I needed to say it clearly because I have been imprecise about important things in my life before, and I don't want to be imprecise about this." Eliza sat with this for a moment. The stars were beginning, one by one, in the east. "I am in love with you too," she said simply. "I have been trying to figure out when it started, and I think it might have been when you came back the second time with a logistics question that didn't need answering, and you knew it didn't need answering, and you came anyway." "I knew it didn't need answering," he confirmed. "I know," she said. "That's when." He reached across the distance between their chairs and took her hand, and she turned her hand to hold his, and they sat like that in the growing dark for a long time without needing to say anything else. The practical complications were real, as Eliza had noted. She had a ranch in Cutter's Bluff, Texas. He had a career that required him to travel constantly between Fort Worth and the territories. Nora was in school. Lewis was her foreman, and she was his employer, and the relationship of 7 years would not survive being handed off to someone else without significant damage to both the man and the ranch. They talked about all of it over the following days with the same directness they had brought to every other conversation. Neither of them was willing to make demands or ultimatums. They approached the question of their future with the same methodical practicality they each brought to everything, and this was perhaps the most romantic thing about them, that they treated their love as a serious undertaking that deserved serious thought. Raymond told her that he had been considering, for some time, making a change in his work. He had saved well over his years as a broker, and the cattle market's dynamics were shifting in ways that made him think brokerage would be a diminishing business within another decade as the railroads consolidated purchasing. He had been thinking about something more settled. "I've been thinking about a ranch," he said, "not a cattle brokerage. Land." Eliza looked at him carefully. "You have been thinking about this for a while," she said. "Long before I came to Cutter's Bluff," he said. "But Cutter's Bluff gave me a better reason to think about it here specifically." "You would stay," she said. "It was not a question. If there was reason to," he said. She looked at her hands folded in her lap. She looked out at the land, her land, Daniel's land, Nora's land by inheritance, and she thought about what it meant to bring someone new into all of this. She thought about what it meant to love someone and be loved back in a way that was grown and clear and mutual without illusion. "There is reason," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, quietly but with complete certainty, "Then I would like to ask you to marry me, Eliza, when you're ready. On whatever timeline makes sense for you and for Nora, I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him. "You're asking now." "I'm asking now," he said. "The answer can come later." "Yes," she said. He blinked. "That was not later." "No," she agreed. "It wasn't." He laughed again, that warm, real laugh, and she laughed too, and it was the best sound on the entire Texas panhandle. They told Nora over breakfast the next morning. Eliza did it directly, the way she did everything, telling Nora that she and Raymond were going to get married, that Raymond was going to stay in Cutter's Bluff, and that nothing about how much her mother loved her was going to change. Nora absorbed this information with her characteristic seriousness. She was quiet for a moment, stirring her porridge. "Raymond," she said finally, using his first name for the first time, "do you like horses?" "Very much," he said. "Do you know how to fix fence?" "I do." "Can you read aloud without stopping at all the hard words?" "I try to." Nora stirred her porridge some more. "All right," she said, and returned to eating, and that was the full extent of her formal approval process, which Raymond later said was the most rigorous interview he had ever undergone. They were married in June at the little white church in Cutter's Bluff, in a ceremony that was simple and attended by the people who mattered. Luis Vega and his wife Carmen, Tomás and his mother, Martha Greer, who had wept continuously from the first note of the hymn, the Reverend Price, and Nora, who stood beside her mother in a white dress she had picked herself, and held the ring for Raymond with enormous solemnity. Eliza wore a dress the color of cream that she had made herself from fabric she ordered from San Antonio. She walked into the church alone because there was no one to walk her in, and she did it with the same direct confidence with which she had walked into room 7 of the Cutter's Bluff Hotel, and signed a cattle contract without waiting to be told she could. Raymond was standing at the altar, and when he saw her come through the doors, the expression on his face was the kind that a person doesn't compose. It simply arrives, and is completely unmistakable, and is its own kind of vow before any words are spoken. They said their words clearly, looking at each other, meaning every syllable. The summer of 1879 was kind, as Texas summers go. Raymond sold his share in the Fort Worth brokerage firm to his former partner, and used the proceeds, combined with what he had saved, to purchase the 200 adjacent acres that lay on the eastern side of Broken Bow land that had been unworked and poorly managed for years by an absent owner in Dallas, who was happy to be rid of it. The eastern acres had a good creek on them and needed work, but they had potential. The Broken Bow, newly expanded to 630 acres, became jointly theirs. He was not a man who needed to put his name on things. He did not suggest renaming the ranch, did not propose reorganizing the existing management structure in ways that would displace Lewis or upset what was already working. He came into the existing enterprise the way he came into everything, paying attention, asking questions, earning his place by virtue of genuine usefulness rather than by ownership alone. Luis Vega, who had been cautiously observing Raymond Fletcher since the first logistics visit, gave his final verdict in the 3rd week of July when Raymond spent 2 full days helping him, and Tomás rebuild the north pasture gate that had been rotting for 2 seasons. Lewis said nothing notable. But at the end of the 2nd day, he handed Raymond the first of the 2 cold beers he had brought out from the house, instead of the second, which was the order in which Lewis distributed everything of value, and which communicated his respect more clearly than any speech. Raymond reported this to Eliza that evening with the quiet satisfaction of a man who understood exactly what had just happened. Nora, for her part, adapted to having Raymond in the house with surprising ease and complete practicality. She assigned him tasks, checking the latch on the chicken coop, reaching things from the high shelf in the pantry, reading to her on Sunday evenings, with the serene authority of a child who has decided to trust someone and sees no reason to be tentative about it. Raymond executed all assigned tasks with complete willingness and no diminishment of dignity, which she seemed to find appropriate. There were moments, many of them, when the grief of the previous year surfaced in Eliza unexpectedly. When Nora said something that sounded like Daniel, or when a particular slant of light hit the house the way it had hit it through the years of a different marriage. Raymond did not try to talk her out of these moments or redirect them. He simply stayed near and said nothing and waited, and that steadiness was its own form of love. She told him one night, lying in the dark listening to the wind moving across the prairie, that she was afraid of loving him as much as she did, not because she doubted him, but because she had loved Daniel and Daniel had been taken, and the fear of loss once experienced never entirely disappears. Raymond was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I don't think I can promise you I'll always be here. I can only promise that I intend to be, every day as long as I'm breathing. And that the love between us right now tonight is real regardless of what the future holds." She turned toward him in the dark. "That's a very honest answer," she said. "You prefer honest answers," he said. "I do," she said, and moved closer to him, and let the fear settle into the background where it lived and would always live, and chose the present with its warmth and its solidity and its very clear, very real man beside her. The fall of 1879 brought the second cattle drive, this one organized entirely by Eliza and Raymond together. They had expanded the herd through the spring and summer purchases, and now had 360 head ready for market. Raymond knew the buyers, the routes, the current prices, information he had gathered systematically and honestly, and that he now brought to bear on their enterprise rather than someone else's. They drove the herd south to the railroad at Abilene, Raymond and Lewis leading the drive, Eliza staying at the ranch with Nora and Tamaz to hold the remaining breeding stock. They got $42 a head on the prime animals and $38 on the secondary lot, and came home with a bank draft that was the largest single sum ever deposited in Eliza's name. "We're doing well," Raymond said that evening, sitting with her at the kitchen table with the ledger between them. "We are," she agreed. "Next year we could push to 400 head if the grass holds," he said. "The grass will hold if we manage the rotation properly in the spring," she said. "Then we push to 400. She looked at the numbers in the ledger, and then looked up at him across the table, and felt a specific kind of happiness that has no name, but is perhaps the most significant kind, the happiness that comes not from extraordinary circumstances, but from an ordinary evening with a person who is entirely right for you, adding numbers together that will build a life. In October of that year, Eliza realized she was pregnant. She told Raymond on a Sunday morning before Nora was awake, sitting at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee and the early light coming through the east window. She told him plainly, the way she told him everything. He went very still for a moment. Then he said, How do you feel?" "Cautiously happy," she said, "and a little frightened, and already thinking about the practical schedule implications." He laughed, and she laughed, and then he got up and came around the table and gathered her against him, and she felt his hands in her hair and his chin resting on the top of her head, and she closed her eyes and breathed him in. "I love you," he said quietly, with the kind of simplicity that is the most powerful form. "I love you too," she said. Nora took the news of a coming sibling with characteristic pragmatism, asking primarily whether the baby would be a boy or a girl, and when told that this was not yet knowable, she appeared to consider both possibilities fair. The pregnancy was not easy in the middle months. The Texas summer was brutal, and Eliza ran hotter than she ever had, and the ranch did not stop requiring her attention merely because she was carrying a child. Raymond worried about her in ways he tried not to make oppressive. He did not tell her to slow down or rest more than was sensible, because he knew she would not, and because telling Eliza Sawyer, Eliza Fletcher now, though she kept Sawyer in the business documents because that was the name on the deed and the name people knew, to do anything was generally counterproductive. What he did instead was quietly take on everything he could absorb, riding the far pastures himself so she did not have to, handling the supplier negotiations in town, making sure the household was running with maximum efficiency, so that the hours she spent on the unavoidable were not compounded by the avoidable. He did it without announcement, and she noticed, and said nothing except to reach across the table and cover his hand with hers on an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon in a gesture that said everything she might have said aloud. In March of 1880, with the spring grass just beginning to green up and the creek running clear with snowmelt from the north, their son was born. He arrived on a cold Friday morning, delivered by the county's midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Ada Fry, who had delivered half the children in the county, and who arrived before dawn when Raymond rode for her in near darkness. The labor was hard but not dangerous, and by mid-morning the baby was in Eliza's arms, a solid, serious-looking boy with Raymond's gray-green eyes and his mother's decisive jaw, born squinting at the world as if he intended to make an assessment. Raymond sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, and then at his wife, and the expression on his face was something Eliza had not seen on him before, a complete and unguarded vulnerability, an openness that had nothing to do with competence or steadiness or any of the qualities she admired in him, but was simply love in its most exposed form. "Hello," he said softly to the baby, which made Eliza's heart turn over in a way it had been doing reliably for over a year and showed no sign of stopping. They named him Daniel James Fletcher. The first name was Eliza's choice, offered without pressure and received without hesitation. Raymond had said immediately and simply, "I would be honored." She had looked at him and known that he meant it, that there was no rivalry in him, no need to erase what had come before, only the expansive generosity of a man who loved her well enough to hold all of who she was. Nora, who was 8 now and had developed firm opinions about most things, declared the baby to be acceptably handsome and offered to help teach him things as soon as he was capable of learning, which she estimated would take several months. She held him with careful competence, supporting his head exactly as Mrs. Fry demonstrated, and informed Raymond that babies needed to be talked to consistently or they would be slow to speak. "Where did you learn that?" Raymond asked. "I read it," Nora said, which was her answer to most questions about how she knew things. The summer of 1880 was full in every sense. The ranch was running well, the herd was healthy, and the eastern acres that Raymond had bought were coming into productivity under Lewis's management. They hired a second full hand, a steady young man from the valley named George Rays who worked without complaint and learned quickly. The roof was repaired and then reinforced. The barn got new doors. The kitchen garden was the best it had been in years. Eliza found a particular joy in these months that she had not expected, not the acute joy of new love, which burns brighter and hotter, but the deeper, slower joy of a life being constructed with intention and care. She would come inside in the evening from riding the pastures or checking on the herd, dusty and tired and completely satisfied with the work of the day, and find Raymond at the kitchen table with Daniel on his knee, and Nora reading aloud to them both from whatever book she was currently making her way through. And the domesticity of it was so ordinary and so completely right that it sometimes stopped her in the doorway, just looking. Raymond would glance up and see her there, and his face would do the thing it always did when he saw her, that quiet, particular warmth that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with the actual feeling. And Nora would say, "Mama, come listen, I'm at the interesting part." And Daniel would wave his small fist in the air and make a sound of general approval, and she would come in and close the door on the evening wind and sit down in her chair. In the fall of 1880, Word came through the county that the Santa Fe Railroad was indeed pushing its line south toward Cutter's Bluff, which meant the economics of the cattle market were about to change significantly. Raymond had predicted this 2 years ago on Eliza's porch, and the prediction was now coming true. They sat together in the evenings for 2 weeks, working through the implications. The railroad would bring buyers directly to the county, which meant shorter drives, lower costs, and more competitive pricing. It would also bring more competition, other ranchers expanding operations, new enterprises moving in. The land values would rise as the railroad made the county more accessible. "We should buy the Riley parcel," Eliza said one evening, spreading the county map on the kitchen table. "If the railroad comes through where they're projecting, it runs within a mile of the Riley boundary. That land will triple in value." Raymond looked at the map. "Riley's asking too much for it right now." "He won't be in a year," Eliza said. "His creditors are impatient. He'll need to sell before the railroad actually arrives. If we wait until the arrival is confirmed, the price will be out of reach." Raymond studied the map for a long moment. "That's a significant capital commitment," he said, "at a time when we're also looking at expanding the herd." "I know," she said. "But the alternative is waiting until it's obvious to everyone, at which point we've missed the opportunity." He looked at her across the map. There was a particular quality to the way Raymond Fletcher listened to her analysis of these decisions. He was not simply humoring her or waiting for her to finish so he could offer a correction. He was actually thinking about what she said, weighing it against his own knowledge, taking it seriously as the business judgment of a person whose judgment he had come to trust. "Let me go to town and look at what we can structure through the bank," he said. "If the terms are reasonable, I think you're right." "I'm usually right about land," she said. "You're usually right about most things," he said, and it was simply a statement of fact. They bought the Riley parcel in February of 1881, 620 acres at a price that made some people in town raise their eyebrows at the risk, and which looked very different 18 months later when the railroad arrived, and the land had done exactly what Eliza predicted. In the meantime, life at Broken Bow continued to accumulate its ordinary richnesses. Daniel learned to walk at 11 months, which Nora declared was faster than average based on her reading, and which Raymond celebrated with a gravity that made Lewis laugh for the first time in recent memory. Nora started taking her lessons from the new schoolteacher in Cutter's Bluff, a young woman named Miss Caldwell who was progressive in her approach, and who recognized immediately that Nora was the kind of student who would outpace her curriculum within a year, if not actively challenged. Eliza and Raymond spoke one evening about Nora's education in the longer term, about the possibility, several years hence, of sending her to a proper school in San Antonio or Austin, someplace with a curriculum that could genuinely challenge her. It was not an easy conversation because it involved acknowledging that Nora's capabilities deserved more than a small county education could provide, and also acknowledging that the prospect of sending their daughter away was painful. "She should have every opportunity," Raymond said. "She should," Eliza agreed. "And she'll come home," Raymond said. "She's the kind of person who always comes home." Eliza smiled. "She already has opinions about how the breeding stock should be managed." "I've heard them," Raymond said. "They're not wrong." They agreed they would revisit the question in a few years, when Nora was older and the options were clearer. It was the kind of thing they did. They put the important questions on the table and came back to them repeatedly, with new information, without the artificial urgency of people who are afraid to let things develop. The spring of 1881 was marked by two things: the first significant rains in 3 years, which greened up the pastures beyond anything Eliza had seen in recent memory, and a letter from Raymond's younger brother in Missouri, a man named Samuel Fletcher, who wrote that he was thinking of coming west. He was 24, trained as a teacher, and uncertain about his future. Raymond discussed the letter with Eliza before responding, which he did with everything significant. "He's at a crossroads," Raymond said. "He's a good man, sharp, but he doesn't always know his own direction. He could teach here, Eliza said thoughtfully. Miss Caldwell is already planning to leave at the end of the school year. She's engaged to a man in San Antonio. Raymond looked at her. That occurred to you immediately. The county needs a good teacher, she said. He needs a purpose. It seems worth suggesting. Samuel Fletcher arrived in Cutter's Bluff in August of 1881, tall and dark like his brother but with a quicker manner, a ready laugh, and an openness that was the complement of Raymond's more measured nature. He was, as Raymond had said, a good man. He was also immediately enchanted by Cutter's Bluff in ways that had nothing to do with the teaching position and everything to do with a young woman named Clara Reyes, who was the sister of their ranch hand George and who worked at the post office. But that, as Eliza said to Raymond one evening with a smile he found endearing, was their own story to tell. Samuel did take the teaching position and took it seriously, and the county school improved considerably under his management. He remained in Cutter's Bluff, rooted himself, found his direction, and became part of the fabric of the place in the particular way that men sometimes find their home not where they were born but where they were needed. The railroad came through in the fall of 1882, and the county transformed the way a slow river transforms a landscape, gradually and then completely. The cattle buyers came, the prices rose, the population grew. New businesses opened on the main street of Cutter's Bluff. A proper hotel was built, a newspaper started. The Broken Bow Ranch, by this point running over 500 head and managing nearly 1,200 acres between the original property, Raymond's Eastern Addition, and the Riley parcel, was one of the most productive operations in the county. People in town knew the name. People in Fort Worth, when they discussed the Cutter's Bluff cattle market, sometimes cited Raymond Fletcher's name alongside the other significant producers. But Raymond was careful to be clear in every such conversation that the Broken Bow was Eliza's ranch, her deed, her heritage, her vision. He had come into it, and he was glad, but it was hers. Eliza, who heard about these conversations through the reliable circuit of county gossip, appreciated this so deeply that she mentioned it to him one evening. "I hear you correct people when they credit you for things that are mine," she said. He looked slightly surprised, as if it had not occurred to him that she would hear about this. "It's accurate," he said. "It costs you something in that world," she said carefully. "To say so." He was quiet for a moment. "It costs me nothing that I value," he said. She looked at him across the kitchen table, where Daniel, now 2.5, was occupied with a wooden horse that Raymond had carved for him over several evenings. Nora was at her books. The lamp was steady. The house smelled of bread cooling on the counter. "I love you very much," she said. "I love you too," he said, "more than I know how to say correctly." "You say it correctly," she said. He smiled and reached across, and she took his hand, and Daniel looked up from his horse and said, "Mama, Papa, look," and held up the wooden horse to show them something he had discovered about its painted eye, and they looked, and admired it appropriately, and the evening continued its ordinary perfect course. In the winter of 1882, Eliza discovered she was pregnant again. She was 35, which she was aware was on the later side, and she told Raymond with the same directness as before but with an additional thread of careful vulnerability in her voice. He listened to everything she said, including the unspoken parts, and said, "Ada Fry will look after you. We'll be careful, and whatever happens, we handle it together." "Together," she agreed. The pregnancy was smoother than the first, which surprised her, and in May of 1883 she delivered a daughter, 7 pounds and abundantly healthy, with Raymond's gray-green eyes and Eliza's dark hair, announced to the world at a volume that Daniel found alarming and Nora found impressive. Nora was 11 now and self-possessed in ways that already suggested the woman she would become, clear-eyed, exacting, possessed of strong opinions and the courage to voice them. She held her new sister with the same careful authority she had once shown with Daniel and said, "She looks like she knows what she wants." "Good," Eliza said from the pillow. "That's a useful quality." They named the baby Margaret Louise Fletcher. Margaret for Raymond's mother, who had died when he was 12, and whose name he had carried forward quietly without ever asking for it. Louise for Daniel's mother, who was still alive in Tennessee, and who sent a letter of congratulation that arrived 3 weeks after the birth and made Eliza cry for a reason she could not entirely articulate, but which had something to do with continuity and the way love persists across distance. The late years of the 1880s were good years. Cutter's Bluff grew, and the Broken Bow grew with it. Luis Vega, who had been with the ranch for nearly 2 decades by now, was showing his age but remained its heart, the steady presence who knew every acre, every animal, every seasonal pattern, and who trained the younger hands with the same patient rigor with which he had always done everything. Raymond and Eliza made sure he was compensated in ways that recognized everything he had contributed, and when his own health began to limit his riding, they restructured his role so that his knowledge and judgment could still be fully employed without requiring him to spend 12 hours in the saddle. Nora, at 13, was already helping manage the breeding records and had a system for tracking animal lineages that was more precise than anything the ranch had ever had. She informed her parents at dinner one evening, decided that she wanted to study animal husbandry and agricultural science at a proper college, and that there was a program available at Texas A&M University in College Station that would, she understood, begin accepting women within the next several years if the current discussions in the state legislature went the right direction. Eliza and Raymond looked at each other across the table. "Tell us more about the program," Raymond said, setting down his fork. Nora told them. She had researched it thoroughly, brought notes, and presented her case with the precision of someone who has been watching how her mother conducts negotiations since early childhood. "We'll support it," Eliza said. Raymond nodded. "Whatever it takes." Nora absorbed this with a brief, characteristic silence, as if she had prepared herself for argument and found its absence slightly disorienting. Then she said, "All right then," and returned to her supper, and Daniel, who was 7 now and idolized his older sister despite her tendency to assign him educational tasks, gave Raymond a look of impressed solidarity from across the table. The conversation about justice in Cutter's Bluff was one that Eliza and Raymond both navigated with consciousness in those years. The county was not kind in all its dealings. To the Mexican families who had worked the land for generations before the American cattle ranchers, to the freedmen who had come north from the coast seeking opportunity after the war, and found it impeded at every turn by custom and cruelty. These were the realities of 1880s Texas, and they were not easy realities. And the Sawyer-Fletcher household was not immune from the complexity of occupying a position of relative prosperity in a landscape of significant injustice. Raymond had grown up in Missouri, where the wounds of the Civil War were close and complicated, and he had thought more carefully about these questions than many men of his station. Eliza had been formed in Tennessee, where the same was true, and the years of building something with her own hands had given her a particular sympathy for anyone who was denied the right to do the same. They paid their Mexican-American hands the same wages as their white hands, which was not universal in the county and which was occasionally commented on. George Reyes, who had been with them for years now and who was as competent a rancher as any man in the county, was paid accordingly. When one of the county's newer ranchers made a point of telling Raymond at the Cattlemen's Association meeting that he was setting a bad precedent, Raymond had replied in his quiet way that he was simply paying the market rate for the value of the work, and that anyone who paid less was getting a subsidy that didn't belong to them, and he had then gone back to his coffee. These were small actions in a large and unjust world, and Eliza knew it, and sometimes the weight of that knowledge was heavy. But she had come to believe that the right response to not being able to fix everything was not to stop doing what you could fix, and she raised Nora and Daniel and Margaret with that belief as clearly as she raised them with anything. By the time the 1890s came, the Broken Bow Ranch was a settled institution. The county had changed enormously. The wild edge of it had softened with time and settlement, the open range era giving way to fenced land and established operations, the railroad having reshuffled the economics of everything. The romance of the frontier, such as it was, had been replaced by something more complex and in many ways more difficult, which was the question of how to build lasting, just, sustainable civilization out of what had been built in haste and often in injustice. Raymond and Eliza were both in their late 40s, and the years had done to them what the best years do, deepen them without diminishing them. Raymond's hair had gone gray at the temples, and there were lines around his eyes that were the lines of sun and weather and laughter. Eliza's dark hair had silver threads in it now that she found she didn't mind, and her face had the particular authority of a woman who has spent decades making consequential decisions and being right often enough to trust herself. They still sat on the porch in the evenings. They still argued about cattle prices and land management and politics, with the same pleasure they had always argued, because they were evenly matched and both of them liked the sharpening. They still read aloud to each other sometimes, though the books had changed. Both of them had developed a taste for history in their middle years, and there was almost always something about the settling of the West or the politics of the Republic or the biography of some significant figure sitting on the porch table between them. Daniel, at 15, was a steady and serious boy who worked the ranch alongside Raymond with a quiet commitment that reminded Eliza sometimes painfully and sometimes joyfully of his father, not Raymond, but Daniel Sawyer, buried under the live oak on the hill, whose name the boy carried and whose temperament he had perhaps inherited through some mystery of grief and memory and the particular atmospheres that form children. He was different from Daniel Sawyer too, of course, formed by different circumstances, steadier in some ways and with Raymond's precision evident in him. Margaret, at 7, was neither steady nor quiet. She was bright and chaotic and physically fearless in ways that regularly alarmed everyone around her except Raymond, who had recognized in her something of himself at the same age, and who approached her fearlessness with more equanimity than perhaps was strictly warranted. She had once climbed to the top of the barn roof to rescue a cat that turned out not to need rescuing, and had come down announcing the superiority of the view from up there. Nora had gone to College Station for her studies, which had become available to women by 1888 in limited form, and she came home for summers and wrote long letters during the school year that were full of what she was learning and what she thought about it. She had developed a friendship there with a young man named Will Hartley, a quiet civil engineer from Austin who was working on water management projects, and she mentioned him in her letters with the careful casualness of someone who is trying not to mention something too much. Eliza read these letters with the particular clarity of a woman who had once been careful about mentioning someone in her own letters, and said nothing to Raymond about her reading, but smiled. Nora came home in the summer of 1891, and Will Hartley came with her, introduced as my friend who was traveling this direction anyway, which convinced no one. He was a slight, thoughtful young man with round spectacles and the kind of precise politeness that sits comfortably alongside intellectual confidence. He knew more about soil chemistry than anyone else Eliza had ever met, and he listened to Nora with the particular attention of a man who finds everything she says genuinely interesting. Eliza served him supper and watched him across the table, and found Raymond watching her from across the same table with a private amusement they shared silently. Will Hartley was in Cutter's Bluff for a week, during which time he rode the ranch boundaries with Raymond, and had a long conversation with Lewis about water drainage in the south pasture that Lewis found extremely satisfying, and spent every available hour with Nora in the quietly joyful manner of two people who have figured out that they prefer each other's company to all alternatives. When he left to return to Austin, Nora stood at the gate and watched him ride away, and Eliza came to stand beside her. "He'll come back," Eliza said. "I know," Nora said. "He said so." "Good," Eliza said. His opinions about pasture drainage were sound. Nora laughed, a real laugh, open and surprised, and turned to look at her mother. At 19, she was taller than Eliza, but the face was familiar in all the ways that mattered. "You like him," Nora said. "I do," Eliza said. "More importantly, you like him and you have good judgment." "Where do you think I got it?" Nora said. Eliza put her arm around her daughter's shoulders, and they walked back toward the house together in the afternoon light. And Eliza felt the particular fullness of a moment that has gathered many other moments into it. The morning she had ridden into town to find a cattle broker, the evening she had signed her name to a contract on a porch rail, the lamplight in room 7, the hand she had held in the dark through a long winter of letters, the laugh she had first heard clearly on a Sunday afternoon that had remade her understanding of what happiness could sound like. The last evening of that summer, when the days were cooling and the grass was turning gold and the smell of autumn was coming in on the north wind, Eliza and Raymond sat on the porch in the near dark the way they had been sitting on porches together for 12 years. His hand in hers in the way it had been since that April evening when he had reached across the distance between their chairs, and she had turned her hand to hold him. Daniel was inside with a lamp and a book. Margaret was theoretically in bed, but could be heard moving around upstairs with what was probably an inadvisable late project. Nora was at her desk writing a letter to Austin. "Do you remember," Raymond said, "the first time I came to this porch?" "You had a logistics question," Eliza said. "I had an excuse," he said. "I know," she said. He turned to look at her in the evening light. "Do you know what I thought the first time I saw you, when you knocked on the door of my room at the hotel?" "What?" she said. "I thought, this is someone who has already decided what she's going to do," he said. "And I was right. You had the whole conversation mapped before you knocked." "Not the whole conversation," she said. "I didn't plan on staying an hour." "No," he agreed. "That surprised me too." She looked out at the land in the failing light, the pastures, the fence lines, the low outline of the barn, the hill with its live oak against the darkening sky. The ranch was the same land and completely different land from the one she had looked at from this porch in the desperate summer of 1878, calculating whether she could survive. It was the same and she was the same and everything had changed. "I keep thinking about that morning," she said, "when I signed the contract." "Tell me," he said. "You were getting up," she said. "I could see you were about to say something. I don't know what, maybe something reasonable, maybe just something about witnesses or a lawyer or taking more time. And I looked at the contract and I knew it was right and I didn't want to wait and I signed it before you could say whatever it was. And I realized immediately that there was nothing to say," he said. "There wasn't," she agreed. "That was when I knew," he said quietly. She looked at him. "Knew what?" "That you were exactly who you were," he said, "and that I had been looking for someone like that for a long time without knowing what I was looking for." The stars were coming out now, the way they always did on the Texas Panhandle, completely, all at once, the whole enormous sky full of them. "We've built something good here," Eliza said. "We have," he said. "Broken Bow," she said. "I never loved the name." "I know," he said. "What would you have called it?" She thought about it for a moment. She had thought about it honestly for 12 years, had never said anything because the name had been Daniel's and she had not wanted to take it from Nora. "Fletcher's Crossing," she said. "Where the creek bends. I always loved that spot." Raymond was quiet for a moment. "Nora would understand," he said carefully. "She's a practical person." "She is," Eliza said. "But I'm not certain it matters anymore. The name is the name. The land is the land. The ranch is what we made it." "Everything we made it," Raymond said. "Together," she said. Margaret's voice came from an upstairs window. "Mama, I need help with something." "Go to sleep, Margaret," Eliza called back. A pause. "It's important." "It can be important in the morning," Eliza said firmly. Silence, then the sound of a small person getting into bed with the distinct dissatisfaction of someone whose important project has been postponed. Raymond was laughing quietly beside her, the low, warm laugh that still moved through her after all this time like a good rain on dry grass. "She's impossible," Eliza said. "She's wonderful," he said. "She's both," Eliza agreed. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he shifted to accommodate her, his arm coming around her, and they sat like that under the full Texas sky while the night deepened, and the house breathed its quiet sounds around them, and the ranch spread out in all directions in the dark, familiar and productive and theirs. Nora's letter to Austin was finished and sealed before midnight. It would go in the morning mail. Will Hartley would receive it in 4 days. He would write back the same day he received it, and his letter would arrive in Cutter's Bluff in the second week of September, and it would contain a question that Nora had been expecting and was entirely prepared to answer. Daniel, reading by lamplight, would fall asleep in his chair and wake stiff-necked and sheepish, and find his father had draped a blanket over him at some point without waking him. Margaret, in the morning, would reveal that her important project had been an attempt to build a more efficient chicken coop latch, which she had drawn in detailed diagrams that were, Raymond would acknowledge privately to Eliza, not entirely without merit. Louis Vega would come out in the morning to start the horses and find the first frost on the fence rails, and would stand in the yard looking at it for a moment, because the first frost always meant the same things: the year turning, the work changing, the particular satisfaction of standing at the end of a good season, and knowing that the season that comes next will be the same ground and different grass, and the same people working it. And on the porch under the stars, Eliza Sawyer Fletcher and Raymond Fletcher sat together in the comfortable, sustaining love of two people who have built their years around each other. A widow who had signed her name without waiting, a man who had ridden back with a logistics question that didn't need answering, and everything that had grown from the clear, mutual recognition that had passed between them on a porch rail in the summer of 1878. The night was very quiet. The ranch was very still. And the live oak on the hill stood solid against the stars, and the creek ran in the dark through the bend they had always loved, and the name on the deed read Sawyer and Fletcher both, and the children slept and the land breathed, and the story that had begun with a signature and a silence had become the whole wide shape of two lives, fully and contentedly and permanently intertwined. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.